in the mid-15th century, the fate of an entire kingdom, and sometimes even a mighty dynasty, could be decided not on a blood-drenched battlefield, but in a quiet negotiation hall over the delicate, fine print of a marriage contract. Such was the case this time, when Lucian VI, the young, gentle, deeply pious, and alas, weak-willed King of Sylvania, was being chosen a suitable match. On Europe's marriage market, he was offered many brides, including the daughters of the Duke of Verone. One was lovely, like a spring flower, the other modest and unassuming. But quite unexpectedly for everyone, the choice fell upon neither of them. The king's counselors drew their attention to a different candidate, Aurelia de Valois, the 16-year-old daughter of Count Hervé de Valois, a man undoubtedly titled yet poor, whose possessions were more ringing, empty titles than actual power. Her father was called King of the Grand Duchy of Rivola, the Kingdom of Chalcedon, and the Siberia Isles. However, all these lands had long been under the authority of others, far stronger houses. She is young, intelligent, and will be a faithful companion to me in matters of peace, Lucian told his close advisors, failing to notice how, in response to his words, the counselors exchanged grave, heavy glances. Aurelia came from a family that was very close to the Lorraine court. She was the niece of the wife of King Claude X. But this very circumstance made her marriage to the Sylvanian monarch less prestigious, if not humiliating, for the kingdom. But the French king had refused to give his own daughter to Lucian VI, and thus the marriage to Aurelia de Valois seemed a necessary compromise. Lucian believed, he sincerely believed, that through this union he would finally achieve the long-awaited peace between Sylvania and Lorraine, ravaged by the 30-year conflict. Peace, he repeated to his counselors when they hinted at the humiliating, burdensome terms of the marriage contract. Only peace can restore tranquility and prosperity to Sylvania. The main point of the treaty was indeed the cessation of war, but the price, as always, was incredibly high. Sylvania had to cede the lands of Tarina and Salmas to Lorraine, territories that had for generations been considered the lawful spoils and inheritance of the Lycans. These concessions were initially kept in the strictest secrecy, but when rumors of them finally leaked out, indignation flared like a fire throughout Sylvania. And yet, the treaty had already been signed, which meant the wedding had to take place. In November of 1444, Eloise d'Argenteuil, the widow of the powerful Duke of Vermont, sailed for Lorraine to meet the future queen, Aurelia, whose reputation was already tarnished before the wedding, and whose coffers held almost no dowry, was forced to travel to a distant foreign land, to a husband she had never once seen. In March of the following year, 1445, Aurelia arrived in Castelbourg, where she was met by Grand Duke Valerius de Forest, one of the most influential Sylvanian lords. He escorted her to Viridia, where the bride was to first see the Sylvanian court. In Viridia, Aurelia found herself face to face for the first time with the woman who would become her main, irreconcilable rival at court. Duchess Ermina de Forest met her in a dazzlingly magnificent gown. The young Lorenese princess, raised in austerity and refinement, could not hide her surprise. "How wealthy they are," she quietly whispered to her lady-in-waiting when she saw Ermina's dress, embroidered with hundreds of pearls. These words reflected Aurelia's first, stunning encounter with the world she, a poor princess, was about to enter. The crossing over the storm sea proved to be a difficult, exhausting ordeal. Storms violently shook the ship, and upon arrival at Port Zalissa, the young queen was bedridden with malaise and exhaustion. Lucian wrote of her with rare warmth. "Our dear and beloved wife is still suffering from seasickness and fatigue." In these words was not only concern, but a quiet, timid joy that finally a wife would be in his life. But it was not the illness, but the encounter with her fiancé that became a true, deep shock for Aurelia. The king, wishing to test his bride's feelings, disguised himself as a humble squire. Kneeling before her, he delivered a letter on behalf of the king himself. The young bride, weary from the long journey, became absorbed in reading and did not even glance at the humble, kneeling messenger. Only later was the cruel truth revealed to her. The king himself, her husband, had stood before her. Aurelia was embarrassed. Unknowing, she had shown unforgivable discourtesy. "My lord," she whispered, covering her face with her hands, "I showed such disrespect to my husband. What will he think of me now?" But Lucian, on the contrary, found in this a sweet and touching proof of her innocence and modesty. It was charming. She was so engrossed in the words that she didn't even notice me. Is that not true sincerity? On the 22nd of April, 1445, their wedding took place at the Abbey of St. Ambrose. The king bestowed upon the bride a ring with a large ruby, taken from his own coronation relic. This symbol of power and faith was meant to forever bind their destinies. A few weeks later, Aurelia was crowned in the grand cathedral of Sylvan City. It seemed the entire Sylvan City welcomed her, greeting her with lavish, incredible festivities, worthy of a true queen. Aurelia was compared to a dove, finally bringing the long-awaited peace. She rode in a carriage covered with white fabric, embroidered with golden patterns. On her head shone a crown, studded with pearls and rare, precious stones. A ruby and sapphire necklace, diamond pendants, a brooch worth thousands of marks. All eyes were fixed on the young queen, but along with this wealth, a terrible burden fell upon her fragile shoulders, the burden of justifying universal expectations. They expected from her not only peace, but an heir, a son who would strengthen the fragile authority of the Lycan dynasty. In the first years after the wedding, Aurelia tried to live up to the hopes placed upon her. Everyone who saw the young queen admired her beauty, grace, and bearing. But very soon, favor and enthusiasm gave way to coldness, and then to open contempt. Lorraine remained an enemy, and the Sylvanian nobility was eternally discontented. The Sylvanian court treated this Lorrainese woman without a dowry with deep distrust. Ladies in luxurious dresses deliberately, defiantly demonstrated their superiority over the newly minted queen, and sharp, poisonous remarks circulated behind her back. The alliance with Lorraine was sold too dearly. We paid for peace with our ancestral lands, without a dowry, without real patrons, and on top of that, the niece of the wife of Claude X, courtiers whispered. Aurelia felt these reproachful, disdainful glances. She was young, but even then understood that she would be judged not by her beauty and manners, but by whether she, this foreign woman, could strengthen the dynasty, the queen's main duty, to give the country an heir. But months passed, then years, yet the desired blessing still did not come, and the cradle in the queen's chambers remained empty. At night, she prayed in her chambers, Lord, give me strength. I am far from home. I am among strangers, but let my life be for the good of Sylvania. Let me give the crown a son, and then all their mockery will cease. Aurelia even began to starve herself with fasts in a desperate hope that God would grant her a son for these physical, unbearable sufferings. Sometimes she would faint right during a meal. Then her ladies-in-waiting would lift the queen from the floor in horror. "For the sake of Sylvania, for the king," she whispered, as they struggled to revive her. But alas, it was all in vain. For 8 years, neither a birth nor even the joyful news of a pregnancy brought cheer to Sylvania. Meanwhile, dissatisfaction and pressure from the nobility only grew. Various rumors began to circulate at court, each one more terrible than the last. "The king is too pious," some gossiped. "He is more drawn to prayer than the marital bed." Or perhaps the fault lies with the queen herself, others whispered. "She is too young, too fragile," or maybe God himself, has turned away from her. It was also claimed that the king was entirely incapable of fulfilling his marital duty. There were those who allowed themselves even crueler, more malicious words, as if Lucian himself was indifferent to women and required assistance in marriage. Every such piece of gossip struck Aurelia's heart, but most of all, she was tormented by her husband's silence. Lucian VI was soft and gentle. He could pray for hours in the silence of the chapel, but rarely spoke of what heavily burdened his soul. "Lucian," she once said softly, placing her palm on his hand, "we are being discussed. They expect an heir." He lowered his eyes. "I pray for a miracle, Aurelia, but perhaps the Lord is testing us." She swallowed her tears, holding them back. Her duty was too great to rely only on prayers. In those years, her rival in status, Ermina de Forest, proudly bore one child after another, and this only added fuel to the fire of discord. The Sylvanian nobility began to look to Forest and his family as possible successors should the Lycan dynasty remain without offspring. "If the queen has no son," the nobleman whispered, "perhaps the Lord himself is pointing us to another heir." Duke Valerius de Forest began to assert his claims to the throne ever louder, ever more insistently. And then, in 1453, something that everyone considered simply impossible happened. Aurelia announced her pregnancy. Sylvan City greeted the news with frantic jubilation. Noble ladies rushed with congratulations. Even Ermina de Forest wrote, "May God preserve the child, who will become Sylvania's most precious treasure." Aurelia responded modestly, but her heart was filled with inexpressible joy. She believed that now her position would finally be unshakable. But just when hope illuminated the royal court, fate struck a terrible, crushing blow. In August of that same year, Lucian VI suddenly lost his mind. The king sat in silence, like an ancient stone statue. He did not speak, did not move, and did not recognize either his wife or his close associates. The king lost his memory and reason. His body became immobile and uncontrollable. For Aurelia, this was not only the grief of a wife, but the complete catastrophe of a queen. "Your Majesty," servants whispered, leaning toward him. But Lucian remained motionless, with empty, glassy eyes, uttering not a word. The physicians hoped that perhaps the birth of the child would awaken him, but alas, it did not happen. In October, Aurelia gave birth to a son, Vincent. The whole country rejoiced, but the general happiness was clouded by the fact that Lucian did not even look at the child. He could not recognize him, could not comprehend that he had become a father. "Look, sovereign," Aurelia said quietly, her voice trembling as she brought the infant close to his bed. "This is your son, your heir." But the king remained silent. Neither a glance nor a movement betrayed the slightest joy in him. Rumors flared up instantly, like a brush fire. If the king did not recognize his son, then the boy is not his. Aurelia's enemies immediately began to claim that Vincent was illegitimate, that this boy was the fruit of Aurelia's secret passion with some favorite. "She brought a foreign child into the court," detractors whispered. "How else can one explain the sovereign's indifference?" For the young queen, this became the most terrible, unbearable nightmare. Proud and vulnerable, she clenched her teeth. Let them lie, let them slander. Someday Vincent himself will prove his blood, his royal right to them. In January of 1454, Aurelia decided on a desperate, bold move. She petitioned to be declared regent for her minor son. "I, the mother of the heir," she told the lords. Her voice was full of determination and strength. "I am obliged to protect his right and the throne until God restores my husband's reason." But Sylvania had never known female rulers. The Council of Lords rejected her claims, appointing Valerius de Forest as regent instead. Aurelia perceived this as a deep, personal betrayal. It seemed to her that her enemies were deliberately depriving her of all influence to quietly prepare the ground for the Forestiers. But on Christmas of 1454, a miracle occurred that changed everything. Lucian suddenly awoke from his stupor. He did not remember the last 18 months, but joyfully accepted his son and recognized him as his lawful heir. "My boy," he whispered, pressing Vincent to himself. "A blessing from God." Aurelia allowed herself to cry for the first time in a long while. Tears streamed down her face, not from fear or pain, but from incredible, long-awaited relief. Now her son was recognized by the king himself. But this meant that Forest was losing power, and the queen's supporters, led by Count Etienne, were returning to court. The Forestiers were not going to relinquish power without a fight, and her son, still an infant, was already becoming the object, the reason for a future war. At night, sitting by Vincent's cradle, she whispered, "You are my angel and my crown. For your sake, I will stop at nothing. If necessary, I will raise the banner myself." In that moment, a completely different Aurelia was born from the gentle, meek wife and mother, a queen ready to become a true warrior. And it was then that Sylvania plunged into flames. The War of the Scarlet and White Rose, named after the emblems of the two dynasties, the red rose of the Lycans and the white rose of the Forestiers, was no longer just a struggle of lords for influence. It turned into a national tragedy, where every family chose whose banner to raise and whose to curse. 1455 marked the beginning of open, irreconcilable confrontation between the Forestiers and the Lycans, and on the 22nd of May, at the walls of the Valentian fields, blood was spilled for the first time in this terrible civil war. King Lucian VI was taken captive, and power essentially passed into the hands of Forest. Aurelia, shocked but not broken, realized that she could no longer rely on her husband. The king was too weak, both in body and spirit. For the first time in Sylvania's history, the queen herself decided to take power into her own hands, and lead the Lycan camp. From that time on, Aurelia knew no peace. She sent letters to the northern counties, where the Lycans maintained their influence, met with barons, appealing to their honor and loyalty to the dynasty. "Consider, lords," she said, "if the throne passes to the Forestiers, who will be the master of your lands tomorrow? Shall we allow a usurper to deprive the king's son of his lawful right?" Such strength sounded in her voice that no one expected from a woman. Even stern knights, accustomed to military speeches, listened to her with deep respect. 1459 became her hour of triumph. An army gathered beneath her banner, and the Forestiers were defeated in the battle at the Morella Bridge. King Lucian VI was freed from captivity, and Duke Forest fled to Britannia. On that day, Aurelia first felt the bitter, intoxicating taste of victory. In the camp, where her knights feasted, she sat beside Lucian, weak-willed, but still king. "You see, sovereign," she said quietly, "they call you king, but it is my banner that leads them into battle." Lucian smiled meekly, wearily. If it grants Sylvania peace, then so be it. But Aurelia already knew then there would be no peace. The Forestiers would return again. In 1460, they indeed returned. The battle at the Arbor Battle ended with Lucian being taken captive again. This time, Aurelia was forced to flee with her son to Montagna, and then seek refuge in Valdoria. In the cold castle where Queen Frideburgus gave her shelter, she spent long, difficult months, formulating new, desperate plans. "We will return, Vincent," she told her son, stroking his golden hair. "I will give you back your throne, even if I have to walk knee-deep in blood." The winter of 1460 brought her a long-awaited chance. Gathering a new army, with the support of the Valdorians, Aurelia marched toward the field of the outcasts. There, in the snowy haze, her army clashed with the army of Duke Forest. The battle resulted in a complete rout for the Forestiers. Valerius de Forest fell. His body was mutilated, and his head, crowned with a paper crown, was displayed on the city wall. It was revenge, bitter and terrible, but necessary for Aurelia. "So shall it be with everyone who encroaches upon my son's right," she declared, looking at the city walls. In early 1461, her army marched south. The second battle at the Valentian Fields brought the Lycans victory, and the king was freed. Aurelia was again beside her husband, triumphant and full of new hope. But Sylvan City, which she approached and wanted to take without a fight, did not open its gates to her. The inhabitants of the capital remembered the raids and plundering of her mercenary soldiers, so the city remained loyal to the Forestiers. This was an unexpected, bitter blow to Aurelia, one she could not recover from. And then came March of 1461. Under a snowfall, in the whirlwind of a furious icy wind, two of Sylvania's greatest armies clashed near the village of Gate of Thrones. This was a battle that would decide the country's fate for years to come. Snow and blood mixed on the field, but the advantage lay with the Forestiers. Valerius VII, the son of the fallen Duke Forest, stood at the head of the victors. The Lycans were defeated. Aurelia and her young son fled to Valdoria and soon found refuge in Lorraine. The years of exile in Lorraine were incredibly difficult for Aurelia. She wandered the court of King Etienne XI, persistently, insistently trying to persuade him to help her reclaim the throne for her son. Etienne was a cautious and cunning ruler, but the Queen of Sylvania knew how to persuade when she wanted to. In 1470, the Lycans raised their banners once more. Valerius VII fled overseas, and Lucian VI, gray-haired and broken, was crowned again. Sylvan City met him in silence. People saw before them not a king, but the shadow of a weak-willed man, brought back only for the sake of other people's political games. Aurelia herself remained in Lorraine. She hesitated, as if her heart sensed the inevitable disaster. Only in early 1471, after long persuasion, did she sail to Sylvania with her son Vincent. "Sylvania will be yours, my boy," she said, standing on the ship's deck, looking at the horizon. Aurelia's premonition did not fail her. Already in April, the Lycans lost their most powerful ally in the battle at the Spring Crossing, but Aurelia decided not to surrender. Gathering an army, she led it to River Glory. Among the Lycan warriors was the young Vincent. The 17-year-old prince proudly led his detachment. He was so much like his mother, fiery, passionate, with burning eyes. The battle did not last long. On the 4th of May, 1471, Aurelia's army was defeated, and the young prince was taken captive. True, some said the prince fell on the battlefield, while others claimed he was brought before Valerius VII, and the latter, hearing a daring, courageous reply, allowed his brothers and soldiers to stab him. But for Aurelia, it no longer mattered. "My son!" An agonizing cry escaped her lips when the terrible news was brought. Her heart felt as if it had been torn apart. The son for whom she had lived, fought, endured exile and humiliation, was dead. And 17 days later, her husband, King Lucian VI, died in prison under unknown, suspicious circumstances. After the defeat, Aurelia was taken prisoner. She was brought to Sylvan City, where the crowd, which once greeted her as the dove of peace, now looked upon her with curiosity and malicious, undisguised joy. "There she is, the Queen of Woes," people whispered. The court no longer looked at her with respect. Servants who had previously bowed before her in deference now walked past with cold, indifferent haughtiness. Sylvania, for which she fought, seemed to have turned away from her. The years of loneliness and humiliation stretched out agonizingly, unbearably slowly. Only in 1475 did her fate change. The Lorenese king Etienne XI agreed to ransom her, but this gesture was not a tribute to the Queen of Sylvania, but rather a way to get rid of an inconvenient figure who had become completely useless in a foreign land. Aurelia returned to Lorraine, but her reunion with her homeland was far from triumphant. No courtly splendor, no honors, only the shadow of former greatness. She lived in poverty, in oblivion, almost without means to exist, mourning the loss of her husband and her only son. All her dreams of a dynasty, for which she had shed blood and raised entire armies, crumbled into dust, like sand through her fingers. The last years of her life passed in silence and bitter, heavy memories. Aurelia, whose determination had shaken the kingdom, was now just a lonely woman, abandoned by history on the wayside. She died in 1482, without a royal funeral, without glory, without hymns. Her passing was quiet, almost unnoticed, but her very life became a symbol of a woman's fierce struggle for the throne, in a world where power was considered to belong only to men. Thus ended the life of Aurelia de Valois, a girl who arrived as a symbol of peace and became a woman who turned into a symbol of war. Her fate is a tragedy and a greatness, a drama of the heart, and the history of a country where love and blood were intertwined in a crown strewn with roses, scarlet and white.